We want to turn now to Politico's Lewis Nelson out of Washington for more on the story and the rest of the news out of D.C. Lewis, what do you think the impact will be? President Trump's latest rant. He's going to San Juan, going to Puerto Rico this Tuesday. How do you think it's going to affect the trip?
Well, it certainly sort of casts, maybe not a pall, but it certainly sort of overshadows the trip and adds sort of a layer to the trip that maybe didn't exist before. But this is very much in character for the president. He's not afraid to feud with people, and he's not afraid to feud with people who he might be perceived as sort of bigger than. He's feuded with the Pope. He is in the middle of feuding with the National Football League, by far the most popular American professional sports league. You can think back to around this time last year where he was feuding with the Khan family, the family of that veteran who died overseas. So this is not sort of out of character for him, and those past feuds sort of haven't really hurt him politically. He hasn't necessarily paid a real political price for those sorts of fights. And so whether or not he'll sort of pay a political price for this one remains to be seen. But it will be an interesting dynamic when he's down there in Puerto Rico next week, whether or not he even meets with the mayor of San Juan. I don't think the schedule is set yet, but it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, we haven't had that schedule released yet. But speaking of politics and paying a price, we know buzzing this weekend is the resignation of Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price. He got this backlash over, obviously, lavish spending on private jets. But do you think that this was just the last straw for President Trump, the fact that Price wasn't able to get GOP to push forward that repeal on Obamacare this week?
I think it's a combination of things. Certainly, the chartered air travel, my fantastic colleagues at Politico reported that only since May, former Secretary Price had run up a bill of more than $1 million between military flights and just chartered aircraft for some flights that are, somewhat questionable. Certainly that's indefensible, and you could see that from the White House, that there was nobody really jumping to defend Secretary Price on those sorts of expenditures of taxpayer dollars. But also the failure to repeal and replace Obamacare also certainly plays a role there. The president has made no secret of the fact that he's been really frustrated with Republicans' inability to get that done. And privately, we've seen reporting that the White House was not pleased, especially in this last effort to repeal and replace Obamacare, that Secretary Price was not as front and center as they might have liked him to be.
And Lewis, I want to ask you about the Senate's budget proposal. What impact do you think this resolution will have on President Trump's efforts to move tax reform forward?
Well, all of this sort of gets down to this measure, this sort of procedure in the Senate, which is always sort of very procedure heavy. It's a procedure called reconciliation that the Senate is allowed to use once a year. They tried to use it this year on Obamacare, on repeal and replace. They're going to try to use it for tax reform as well. And basically, it's a procedure that allows them to pass this on a party line vote. They can pass it with as few as 50 votes, along with the tie-breaking vote of the vice president. That allows them to sort of go around the Senate's normal filibuster rules that would typically require 60 votes in the Senate, which then you have to get Democrats, which is going to be a lot tougher to do on repeal and replace and on tax reform as well.
So does this hurt the president's chances of working with Democrats in the future? We've seen him going out to these big rallies with Democrats who are in some districts, up for re-election in 2018. Will he be able to work with them on other issues like immigration, for instance?
I think there is a decent chance that he can work together with Democrats on immigration, and we've seen that. There's a little bit of a debate between Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and the White House as to whether or not a deal on that DACA program to help out Dreamers, young immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children illegally. Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi say there's a deal already in place. The White House has said, not so fast quite yet. That's an issue, I think, where there is a decent possibility of working together. But on other issues, tax reform especially, Democrats have stopped just short of saying, look, we don't think we're going to be able to work with the president on this. There's a lot of things in there that Democrats it's just totally anathema to their agenda. But there are some sort of vulnerable Democrats, people like Joe Donnelly, who traveled with the president this week, Heidi Heitkamp, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, just to name a few, who are in Democratic senators in states that the president won in 2016. So, they might be a little bit more incentivized to work with the president, but whether or not they sort of stay unified with their party or break off and work with the president. That's remains to be seen.
Speaking of breaking off with the president, we've learned that the House is investigating the alleged use of private emails by some of his staffers. Among them, it includes his own president, the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. How significant is this? And do you think that this might eventually force him and his daughter-in-law out of the White House?
To say that it might push Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump out of the White House, there's no indication that they're anywhere close to that yet. And of course, it's important to remember that the two of them, I don't know if they get preferential treatment, but they are family. They are certainly held in different esteem by the president than somebody like a Reince Priebus or even a Steve Bannon. These are people who you're going to see at Thanksgiving and Christmas and things like that. They're family members in addition to being White House staff members. But it is a big deal. Around this time last year, it's easy to think back to the president sort of reveling in these lock her up chants at his rallies. And those were all about Hillary Clinton having a private email server. And so now to hear that his own staff members and high-level staff members like Jared and Ivanka, but also Reince Priebus, Steve Bannon, Gary Cohn, who's a big economic advisor, were all conducting White House business on private email service. It's a big deal. The fact,
Louis, we're hearing reports that the NSC came to them and said you need to be doing your email on these servers, on company email, not personal email. So if that is in fact true, what's the recourse for this? Do officials just get away if you use your own email and it's a loophole and no one's going to do anything about it?
I think the biggest tool that's going to be used moving forward, I think, by congressional investigators and potentially by the White House, which has launched its own internal investigation, is frankly sort of, for lack of a better word, shame or publicity on this. It certainly does not look well. The optics are pretty bad on this for the White House, for a president who sort of relentlessly attacked Hillary Clinton, characterized her as not being transparent, as having something to hide, by sort of using this Hillary Clinton's private email server against her, sort of using it as like a rhetorical hammer against her. It's not great optics for the White House to then turn around less than a year later and have, more or less the same problem on their own hands.
All right, Louis Nelson, thank you so much for joining us, Louis.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Rena.